Thank you very much for the introduction. I would just like, before starting, to follow up on your comment that I think reality has taught us that there is nothing black or white. This is the ideal approach, but it's far from reality. There are many shades of gray, and we need to understand the shades of gray and give relevant recommendations to the population. Now, coming to my presentation, it's very hard within 15 minutes to provide an update of all research, so I just focused on 3 or 4 points that have been recently raised, which does not cover all the important and interesting things, but considering the time constraints, I thought this should be most interesting for the readers. So starting with something that has caught the attention of everyone since last year, including the media, globally, but especially in the US, and it's the case of EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping-associated lung injury. It was an outbreak of acute respiratory toxicity cases in the US since July 2019. There were a lot of visits to the emergency department of people who were mostly young age, but not exclusively. That included adolescents that were reported to be vaping, and the disease appeared to develop within days or a few weeks of the symptoms. It was one of the main criterion for diagnosing something with EVALI, that the development of the disease happened very rapidly, so it was an acute respiratory toxicity. The cases were characterized as vaping-induced, and of course the name, of course, implies that it was associated with vaping or e-cigarettes. In terms of symptoms and pathophysiology, people presented with respiratory, gastrointestinal, and constitutional symptoms, but basically they were suffering from the respiratory failure with several different forms of disease presented in chest CT, basically. A lot of people ended up in intensive care units because of respiratory failure. A very substantial proportion required mechanical ventilation, and even a few cases required extracorporeal oxygenation. Concerning, however, the epidemiologic perspective, let's not forget that this is something that started in summer 2019. So before knowing any specific information about the cause of the disease, we could approach this issue and have some preliminary conclusions. So even before knowing what causes the outbreak, what we can suggest based on past knowledge is that, first of all, declare some facts that e-cigarettes have been used widely globally throughout the world for about 10 years, up to the time that the outbreak occurred in the US. There were millions of consumers, both in the US and globally, more than 10 million frequent users in the US at that time, over a long period of time, over so many years. Over these years, there was no other outbreak of acute lung injury in any country. There were case reports, but case reports are things that happen very frequently, even with medications which are approved and remain approved. So there was no outbreak of a lot of cases. So suddenly, within a few months, in only one country, there are some scattered cases, case reports in other countries, there was an outbreak of a serious acute respiratory condition. We should emphasize the term acute, leading to respiratory failure, mostly in young people, including underage people, but not exclusively in young people. So how can we interpret this information? First of all, being an acute disease, it is not related to long-term use of e-cigarettes. This is because of the criterion of diagnosing the disease, first of all. These cases are very unlikely, if not impossible, to be related to e-cigarette products that have been available for years in countries outside the US too. Otherwise, we would have observed similar outbreaks in previous years, not only in the US, but also in other countries. And these cases can only be attributed to two possibilities. One is that some products conventional nicotine vaping products were recently produced and or modified with a different composition compared to previously available products. And this could be one cause of the outbreak. And it could also explain the timing of the outbreak. And these products must be products available in the US, otherwise we would have seen the same similar outbreaks in other countries. And the other possibility, of course, is that something irrelevant, not related to nicotine-containing products, were used and termed vaping, and that was what may have caused the disease. But it is very difficult to attribute a sudden outbreak in 2019, 10 years after using e-cigarettes, to conventional products that are used everywhere. Some additional reasons why nicotine-containing products are unlikely to be the cause is that PG and VG are solvents that have been used since the beginning, and these are the main ingredients of e-cigarettes, so they cannot suddenly cause acute respiratory disease. Nicotine and flavors have also been used, but no one can exclude that some new components, some new ingredients have been introduced into the liquids. And of course, when some flavorings are difficult to dissolve, usually ethanol is used, which is not considered that toxic for the respiratory system in order to cause an acute intoxication. But since the beginning, there were some reports that people were using, some of these patients were using THC products. So cannabis products containing tetrahydrocannabinol. And the major difference between these products, which can be used with a battery and a resistance device to produce aerosol and vape them, but they are very different from the conventional products. THC products and THC by itself is highly lipophilic, contrary to nicotine, which is highly hydrophilic. So THC products are difficult to be dissolved in PG and VG. Being lipophilic, they are highly soluble in vegetable oils, and you need to use different solvents. Vegetable oils, in fact, separate in a nicotine-containing liquid, so you cannot use them with nicotine-containing liquids. And these are the preliminary assessments that can be made considering this epidemic before knowing more details about this outbreak and specifically the cause of the disease. Now, in order not to present myself as some kind of a prophet after we know what has happened, these are exactly the two slides that I presented on September 12, about 15, 20 days after the first announcement of the FDA. And sorry, it was September 12, 2019, not 2020. It was last year. And these are the slides that I presented at the SRNT Europe annual conference in Oslo, Norway, last year. The end of the outbreak has been announced by the CDC in the meantime. It was announced through a tweet on February 25. And as you see, it was attributed to vitamin E. Vitamin E is a lipid, a lipophilic substance which was used as a solvent in some illicit THC products. So we are almost sure today that this was a case of some illicit THC products which introduced a solvent which probably is toxic, although the CDC has not still excluded the possibility that something else may also contribute to the cause. But the main conclusion is that it was vitamin E, which can only be used in THC liquids. It cannot be dissolved in nicotine liquids. The outcome until February 25th, 2020 was about 2,800 hospitalized cases in all states and 68 deaths. The problem, however, with calling the disease e-cigarette or vaping-related disease is that this represented a tremendous failure of science communication, because most people, even today in the US, believe that conventional e-cigarettes are a reason for EVALI, and some who were asked specifically even suggested and responded that THC content or even vitamin E content is irrelevant to the real risk and the real cause of the pandemic. Of the outbreak, sorry. This represents a typical case of failure in science communication, a failure in risk communication, and a serious misinformation and misinterpretation of the data by the population. Now, moving forward to another case of what we may certainly characterize as bad science is one of the cases discussing one study presenting the risk of e-cigarette use, the risk for myocardial infarction associated with e-cigarette use, a study that was published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. I'm not going to expand on cardiovascular disease and discussing about e-cigarettes as a risk factor because there are other presentations, but I'm going to present this case, which was an analysis of the prospective PATH study in the US. This specific study analyzed wave 1, 2013 and 2014, and examining the association between e-cigarette use and myocardial infarction, having a myocardial infarction among these participants. It was found that daily cigarette use especially, but also some days cigarette use was strongly and statistically significantly associated with myocardial infarction. Of course, in the same way as tobacco cigarette use, there was no doubt about that. And the authors also attempted to perform a reverse causality analysis to identify whether it was the myocardial infarction that caused the adoption of e-cigarette use, and not that the e-cigarette use caused the myocardial infarction. So they used some regression analysis. They isolated cases of myocardial infarction that happened after 2007, and they still found that there was no reverse causality, so they attributed their finding to e-cigarettes being a risk factor for myocardial infarction. However, the problem was in their approach. The thing is that PATH study, which was designed by the FDA and the CDC, contains a lot of information about the temporal association of both e-cigarette use and developing any kind of disease. The study asks also for other types of disease. For example, they have a question asking how old was the participant when he or she first used an e-cigarette, how old the participants were when they started using e-cigarettes fairly regularly, and how old they were when they developed a myocardial infarction. So the authors could have very easily identify those participants who had the myocardial infarction before initiating cigarette use. As you understand, we cannot discuss about the cigarette use being a risk factor when the disease, the outcome has happened before the risk factor has occurred. And unfortunately, the authors admitted in their paper that they knew this information, but they failed to use that. And they still concluded that e-cigarettes were a risk factor. Well, Brad Rodu from the University of Kentucky had done a similar analysis. However, he took into consideration the information about the timing of the events, and he found that the vast majority of e-cigarette users who participated to the PATH study and who reported that they had a myocardial infarction, the heart attack happened long before they initiated e-cigarette use. And after excluding those participants, there was no significant association between e-cigarette use and myocardial infarction. And when I say we, I'm talking about 15 scientists, mostly Americans, 3 scientists from the UK, and one was myself. We sent 2 letters to the Journal of the American Heart Association presenting the problems in the analysis in the study and the fact that the authors acknowledged that they knew the data on the timing of the events. They acknowledged that in the discussion section of the paper. We also presented to the editors the analysis by Brad Rodu, and the paper was eventually retracted. Concerning e-cigarettes and smoking cessation, we know pretty well that e-cigarettes would have been useless unless they promote smoking cessation. And one of the important determinants on the public health effects of e-cigarettes is whether they do promote smoking cessation. I think that today, after so many years, and without having a lot of randomized control trials, but we need to understand that e-cigarettes are not used as medications and as a therapeutic intervention. They are used as a lifestyle choice and a change in the lifestyle from using tobacco cigarettes to e-cigarettes. They are not prescribed with a specific dose. There is no specific dose. There is not even a common pattern of use. Different smokers smoke their cigarettes differently, and different cigarette users use their devices differently and also use different devices. So it's a behavioral intervention and not a strictly therapeutic intervention. We can find that indirect data looking at associations from large population studies that reporting being a daily cigarette user is strongly associated with being a recent former smoker without knowing the timing of the events. In this case, from the Eurobarometer 2017 survey of 25,000 Europeans. Why we look specifically at the timing of quitting? Because we know that former smokers who have quit long before e-cigarettes were invented or were widely available, in these population groups, e-cigarettes are not very popular, and that's a good thing. So you cannot analyze the effects of e-cigarettes on quitting smoking by collectively examining all former smokers, because in the Eurobarometer, more than 60% of former smokers had quit more than 10 years before the survey was conducted, so before e-cigarettes were invented. So you need to look at people who have quit smoking, and in this study they reported the time when they quit smoking, within the period that e-cigarettes were available in the market. In one very well conducted randomized control trial, despite some reactions, it's one of the best conducted randomized control trials, considering that they were assessing a behavioral intervention. The authors should be congratulated for giving the participants the opportunity to choose whatever they want, and even in the NRT group, choose multiple NRT groups. That's how RCTs for a behavioral intervention should happen. They found that e-cigarettes were about twice as effective as NRTs. Concerning the use by youth, this is going to be the last part of my presentation, and this is, of course, a very important topic. It has created a lot of concern in the scientific and public health community, especially in the US, because we know pretty well that e-cigarettes can be quite attractive to youth. And since 2010, there has been a gradual but large increase in e-cigarette use among US youth. Youth means below the age of 18. In 2020, a few days ago, the latest data were announced. 4.7% of US middle school students were past 30 days users. This means that the minimum was taking one puff in the last 30 days. So this definition of current use includes any kind of use within the past 30 days. It was significantly reduced from 2019, but imagine that in 2010 it was almost zero. In high school students, there was also a very substantial decrease in 2020 compared to 2019 in current e-cigarette use in high school students. But again, there was a large increase over the past 10 years. So there are a lot of concerns by the authorities that e-cigarettes may be a product that will lead to dependence on nicotine and could cause harm because it's not a harmless product, of course. However, when you look at frequency of use and you look at the smoking history of adolescents in the US who are using e-cigarettes, you will see that frequent and especially daily use of e-cigarettes among never smoking youth is extremely rare. There has been some increase, for example, in this case, in our latest study from 2017 to 2018, but still it is below 0.5%. And if you look at 2015, it did exist, but again, the proportion of never smoking, of non-smoking youth who were using e-cigarettes frequently was very, very low. At the same time, and this has important public health implications, you see that over the period that e-cigarette use became popular, despite being mostly experimental and mostly confined to smoking youth, smoking rates in the US have been decreased at unprecedented levels, a very fast decrease compared to the previous period too, but the rates of smoking among youth now in the US, and this is 2019 data, are almost zero. The daily smoking in US youth is less than 1%. So we are witnessing a generation of a smoke-free generation among in American adolescents today. It's almost becoming a smoke-free generation. And this has very important public health implications, of course. The same, we know the same is happening in the UK. They have studied the smoking prevalence of e-cigarette users, of youth e-cigarette users, and they are seeing that very, very few are never smokers. And that's why some countries such as the UK, basically it's the only country, so you can call it an exception, are approaching e-cigarettes as a major tool to combat smoking, so as part of the solution, not as part of the problem. And we are seeing in the UK vape shops opening inside the hospitals, and I mean inside the building, the main building of the hospital, not in the greater area of the hospital, in order to promote e-cigarettes to smokers as a smoking cessation aid and not as a medication. It's not prescribed. So in conclusion, after all these years, e-cigarettes still appear to be very low, but of very low risk, but there is definitely an existing risk, there is no doubt. They appear to be effective as smoking cessation aids, and basically that's also the main reason why they are used, especially by adults. Most of them use it to reduce or quit smoking. The use by youth is something that we need to be concerned about, and it is something that we need to monitor, but it is largely confined to youth with a smoking history, and it is also largely experimental. And it has been accompanied without suggesting, we don't have proof that e-cigarette is the reason for the reduction in smoking rates, but at the same time that e-cigarette was growing, there is a strong reduction in smoking rates in US youth. They represent by far the strongest competitors to tobacco cigarettes because they are the most popular product used as an alternative to smoking by smokers, irrespective of whether we healthcare professionals recommend it or not. And of course, there is no reason to suggest e-cigarette use in non-smokers. And of course, regulations that are already implemented, especially in Europe, on the youth sales ban should be strongly and strictly implemented in order to avoid access of these products to youth. Thank you very much.